टाइम। अपने शहरों को अपना बनाएंगे, हमने तय कर लिया है। अपने शहरों को सेफ बनाएंगे, हमने तय कर लिया है। कैदी बन के ना अब जी पाएंगे।
Right now, the session that we are talking about is looking at the whole issue of social infrastructure and governance. And it's a very critical question that we all need to really bring the issue of safety, but a right to city, especially in the context where we are seeing, like the discussion we were having, is that in a way, the larger capital is taking over our cities. The land mafia is taking over our cities. I mean, Sonal was just saying that while we are discussing all the infrastructure, people upstairs are discussing how are we going to, in a way, almost privatize the public transport. The whole augmented transport is the new word that they are talking about, that we don't need public transport as the only thing available. But in that whole process, the campaign that is happening in Bombay city on saving the BST bus, there's a whole big campaign that's happening on Our Mumbai, Our Transport, Amchi Mumbai, Amchi Best. So the whole idea is that this is a conversation we are having in this larger context of everything being pushed on privatization. And we are not able to challenge. One of the questions that even with Jagan that I was trying to raise is that we are tweaking the development plans, we are tweaking the master plans, but we can't give up that either. So we are caught in this thing that while we are challenging the larger private forces, we also have to still try and negotiate what is it that we can get out. And today's panel is going to try and bring some of those conversations out, which takes care of marginalization, not just of gender, but like what we looked at yesterday in the different conversation, which different kinds of people are getting marginalized, what's happening to the poor in the city, what's happening to women in the city, what's happening to transport in the city. So that is the conversation that we are going to do. And I'm just going to start a little bit about talking about what attempts we have done. And like I said, it's in the larger context of the limitation of our work, recognizing that we are still all finding our own tweaking to be done. And in that context, what is the attempt that we are trying to do? What I'm trying to bring in, that what we are talking about is trying to challenge the fear of violence that each one of us is experiencing as women. And we are trying to connect it to the issue of livelihood, opportunity, leisure, and mobility, and putting it in the context of our right to the city. And in leisure, the different aspects of accessing the city, in the different opportunity also accessing the city. And the question that we've been raising from yesterday are that every aspect of our space is being taken away because we are not able to access the city in the same way. What we have tried to do in this context is, like we talked about, the crowdsourced data that we are trying to bring in is one aspect of how do we build evidence that city is safe or unsafe. And this is a continuous process that we have to bring. So our effort has been to continuously find how we can try and improve the response system that our city can give us. So one of the effort that we have done is to improve and set up an emergency police helpline with the police. This was done after the 2 young women were molested outside a 5-star hotel on 31st night. And we went to the police in Mumbai and we said that we are not only interested in you catching hold of the culprits, but we are interested in a long-term way in which you're going to respond to violence against women. And like 100, 103 is a helpline that is set up in Mumbai, and it's been now 10 years, and it's working very effectively with almost a 10-minute response time that the police will arrive at a spot where a call has been made. And of course, the major amount of calls are for domestic violence, but the second highest is street harassment, as the second caller data that shows. What we are finding is, again, like what we are saying, that we are not, while we are fighting for BEST not to be privatized, we are also working with BEST to see how can it be more gender friendly, and our effort has been to work with the bus conductors to get a gender curriculum in the main curriculum of the entire BEST transport. And the biggest thing that we found is that if a BST conductor even just announces in the bus, stand straight, look how you're standing, is enough to tell the guy not to do anything. So a lot of time it's not about direct intervention, but it's about preventive measure that can be taken. So our constant thing is, can we find in everything we are doing who can be the preventive agent for us, whom we can work in some way so that some kind of prevention can happen, and that role can be played. And the same thing that we are trying to do now with the Railway Protection Force, where we are trying to say that if Railway Protection Force can do safety audits and provide what are the safety audit data on a regular basis to the entire mechanism, a certain thing of prevention, like even in our safety audit, we found that in front of the ladies' compartment, there will be gangs of boys who will be sitting there. Now, if these kinds of data can be generated and gathered and on a regular basis acted upon, things can be slightly more prevented and it can become safer. While we are doing other things like changing gender norms and other ways, our entire process has been to say, how can young people be part of these kinds of process? And the third area, which I'm going to talk a lot more in detail, is the gender inclusive planning process, where the development plan where we have worked, and the overarching institutional framework that we think we need to have for any kind of cities to become gender inclusive. We need to have a group that's going to look at it in a long-term way. But the first thing that I really want to bring in is that while we are challenging everything about planning, the main principle of planning, the whole modular, what they call the anthropometric scale on which the planning is done, is clearly taking a man as the way of doing. So why is it that always our bus handles are so high and they never think about women are going to use it? Why is it that everything is done because it's done for a white man to be standing up, and it's that measurement that's going to decide everything about how much of space you need in a toilet, how much of space you need. So every architect planning is done on this design, and this is not where we are actually even challenging. And I think that when we are talking about gender inclusive planning and urban design, we will have to get into how are they looking at women being part of this kind of designing. So in this attempt to bring in certain element of gender inclusion, and Amita is also part of it, Sujata is part of these process. So all organizations in Bombay who are anywhere connected to working in communities, housing, all of us came together in a big campaign group called Hamara Shahar Vikas Abhiyan. And each of us are part of our specific location. So we took up the whole thing of gender. Like that, some groups took up child rights, housing. So different perspective with which we try to intervene in the master plan of Mumbai. And we try to bring in various voices to be heard. The gender plan actually took up a whole load of areas of affordable housing, education, health. And the first draft we made, which was given to a French consultant company that was drafting the master plan, not a single word about gender came into that draft, not even one word. And we had at least 3 to 4 meetings with them, and we were very positive that, they understood what we were talking about. But somehow it just became very diffuse. All our demands were very diffuse. And so when the second time around, when we went for the review committee was set up and we went to them, we actually went with a little bit more focus demand, and we said our focus is to increase working women's participation in Bombay City, which is as low as 16%. So if you're talking about a vision of a city, which is a financial city, where are the women? And that somewhere clicked, and that got them to start thinking about it. So sometimes I'm saying that, we go with a lot of information, lot of data, lot of our experience, but we have to find that one thing that's going to work for them and work for us, and that can take us forward in a more clearer way. Once that got them thinking on that area, relatively we were able to bring in a lot more aspects of not just talking about working women, but also other women. So we could broaden it, but it allowed us to really bring lot of amenities that are connected to having women in the city. So we demanded something like multi-purpose housing for working women. Like what I gave an example yesterday, that single women in Bombay city, it's very, very difficult to have any ability to hire anything. One, it's very expensive. And two is that there is a whole load of moral control on whether you can hire a space or not. So we demanded that if a single woman is coming, where is she going to stay, and can we provide as a city some space for her to be there? And in that, we have also included women shelter homes, and we don't want to call it shelter homes, so we've called it housing for emergency. So anybody having 2-day, 4-day, 5-day emergency, a long-term emergency, we are going to create a space. So this is like a multi-purpose in a way that it will be a long-term, a 3-year housing, as well as short-term, like 5-day guest coming to Bombay city. Where do they stay? Is there a kind of a space in which they can actually live? And we were able to get 27 such land reservation done in this plan, where we've been allocated the BMC land so that we can actually build, because if it's a private land, then we have to buy off, and that's not what government is going to do. So that kind of possibility reservation was possible. The second demand, which was very strong, was where are the care centers, because the vision, the expectation in the Bombay city is that it's going to become more and more nuclear family because of the size of the housing and because more migrants are coming to the city. So we are saying that if we want women to be in workforce, where are the how are you going to look after the children? And right now we have almost 3 per ward allocation done for childcare center or neighborhood care centers, and Aadhaar Kendras are the skill and livelihood centers, and we even have for public toilets, allocation for senior citizen home, and creating a kind of space for a lot of land reservations to be done. But I just want to say that as women's organization, somewhere we have not engaged with this whole idea of land reservation. What does it mean to understand a master plan? What are the development control rules? And it's something that we have kept ourselves away. But I think that this is a time for us to really come in, because we're talking about 20-year, if we want any amenities, if we don't intervene in our master plan, we'll never get it. So that is the reason why I think that we need to engage in this kind of process. And the last thing I want to say is that what our attempt now is to create a gender advisory group within the municipal corporation to allow us to play a larger monitoring role, larger visioning role, and also be a liaison with citizen and municipal corporation. And we have done it in a way that it shouldn't be only a women's organization space. It has architects, it has urban planner, it has people from media, it has people from different walks of life. So it becomes a larger citizenship group and not just a women's organization space.
So I'll start with talking about infrastructure, and I found the title of this session very intriguing, to talk about social infrastructure. And we are talking about social infrastructure in currently a time and age where the sole purpose of city governance is thought to be infrastructure creation. And I think, therefore, it's important to locate that debate first, because that is the macro context within which one is really discussing today the socialness of infrastructure itself. So how are policies looking at infrastructure today? For a very long time, infrastructure was thought of as a long time expenditure made from public finance and by public institutions, whether it is different public sector institutions like railways or transport, or you would see the PWDs and all others involved, to now looking at infrastructure really as an investment and a lever for growth, which means that you use infrastructure to generate more growth in particular areas. Here we are talking about cities. Okay, so which means that the financialization of infrastructure here assumes a very, very big role. It also brings in other considerations, which are largely in terms of looking at infrastructure in terms of recovery and maintenance. It also means that you're looking at infrastructure, what choices you make. How do you make those choices? What scale do you pitch infrastructure? So here there are very different forms of planning now being thought, from the earlier statutory planning processes such as development plans and land use plans, one is now moving to things like comprehensive development plans, etc. Okay, and through all of this, infrastructure gets bracketed as projects. We were talking of, and I had raised a question about projects in the morning, but this something called projects, which characterizes a NGO culture, is very much part of the overall governance repertoire today. And what it means is that when everything gets converted into a project need not go through all the public consultative processes that Nandita was earlier referring to. It is something which can be introduced as a partial something, though there may be a larger strategy in place. And this is important to note. Okay. The next is from urban local governments itself and line agencies, one is increasingly moving the onus of action to a different agencies, which are parastatals, actors such as consultants, experts, and forming PPPs. That's become, and I think these trends in infrastructure itself are important because they represent a very clear shrinkage of democratic processes itself. The introduction note of this panel talked about Simone. So I don't know how seriously Simone was taken, but I decided to take Simone's work very seriously and really apply myself a little bit theoretically. Can't resist that here. And talking about, so Simone talks about people as infrastructure. Okay? And I thought this is a very interesting counter perspective to the entire perspective on infrastructure that we talked about and the trends which were there. So there are two aspects that people as infrastructure actually brings in. Number one, that in most developing countries, the state is not the primary actor in infrastructure. And therefore, that infrastructure building, infrastructure development remains a largely incomplete task when it is only undertaken by the state. The second aspect of this, Simone's thesis, is basically that there are several people and significant sections of people who take on the task of creating infrastructure for themselves. And I think, again, that is very important. When you see what we call as slums or informal settlements, these are all people who are engaged in actually creating things like housing, sanitation, other kinds of services for themselves. So I think what this means is that you need to think about what is the role that people play and what is that people have agency in creating infrastructure. Okay, it is not just the state which has agency, it is people who also have agency. And the minute one accepts that, then there is a new form of partnership that one needs to do. And that partnership has to be with local communities and not just with private sector as one understands it. Okay? And finally, you need to also understand what is the knowledge involved, what is the institutional base behind these infrastructures. So I thought I would give two cases within which one is locating this. Okay. And the first I thought of a field and best, as all of you know, have been the literal lifelines of Mumbai. There has been a recent survey which talks about the overall, what I would say, the carbon footprint in Mumbai being much lower and largely owing to its public transport. And yes, I think it has played a very, very critical role. So how have these lifelines actually accommodated women? And I'm using this term accommodated in a very deliberate way, because how they have responded to women is through reservation of compartments. So first, half a compartment for women in the railways increased to 1 compartment in the second class. Then currently it is like 2.5 compartments in a 12 compartment train. Okay. Then there are special trips for women, and there is reservation of seats for women, about 6 seats in BST buses, which overall carry 50 seats. Okay? So that's how one accommodates women. But the overall perception within this is that, what is the commuting pattern of women? Women travel short distances, they make multiple trips, and they move through off-peak hours. So you maintain that kind of regime. Okay? And what one is seeing is, post the 1980s, this entire belief and stereotyping of women and their commuting patterns has actually been thrown apart by 2-3 things. Number one, that the city is growing beyond the island city, and it's becoming a polycentric economy. So therefore, these lifelines, which largely traveled north-south and were laid down in north-south manner for the railways, and the bus trips, which kind of transported people from the stations inwards, and some north-south trips again. So this entire design itself was actually torn apart in some ways. The second, I think there is a challenge to expand further for the suburban railways, because how does one create a localized suburban service? Because the minute one talks of Mumbai Suburban Railway, it is linked to the larger railways ministry at the central government level. So they can't think of how does one operate and create a localized system of transport, subject that to local decisions, etc. And you also have the challenge of the privatized metro. That is where your new direction of investment-oriented infrastructure is taking you. Within all of this situation, there are several invisible groups. So one is women in peripheral areas. And when I say peripheral areas, these are areas which are beyond the island city. If you move further into the extended suburbs and in areas which are beyond the Municipal Corporation of Mumbai, but which are still connected by the Mumbai Suburban Rail Services, you will find there are immense difficulties that women face, firstly in reaching the stations themselves. Okay? And if you look at the timings of the train, new routes which are being contemplated, one basically begins to see that people like nurses, BPO workers, fisherwomen, and I'm deliberately giving these different sectors through different income groups to say these are all women who work extreme hours, but they find no place within the overall planning for commuting at all. Luggage compartments, it is like they are made only for men. There is half a luggage compartment in the railway compartments, railway bogies for women, for luggage. And within that half a compartment, men, women, everyone, it's like a free for all literally there. It's very difficult for women to get space. Then for pregnant women, how do they even navigate platforms? Okay? Because platforms are like rushed. You may create a compartment space, but no one has thought of what is the walkway to get to the compartments themselves. The space for physically challenged women, again, that's like a teeny-weeny space which has been created within the railway compartments, which is like 1/8 of a compartment. And again, it's like a gender-neutral space. So when it comes to including women within that, women who are physically challenged find it very, very difficult to access trains. You've looked at infrastructure, but just think about the governance. And this is where then the entire spate of issues which is linked to non-safety starts. I'm not going to go into detail because my time is really limited, but just look at the range of issues here. What is the response to complaints of harassment? We have surveyed about more than 2,000 women in the city. And what we find is that women dare not make complaints. The entire system is constructed in such a way that if you get to a follow-up of a system or a complaint of harassment, police say, you will have to go to Kalyan station in order to register your complaint. Okay? So you leave your entire business for the day. You go to Kalyan court to register your complaint, and thereafter, if you have to follow up in court, you have to constantly keep on going there. So you make complaining and the follow-up into such a tedious and a harassing process that many women prefer to forego and not engage with these processes at all. Then you think of responsiveness to other issues. So I think just the spate of commuters in Mumbai means that we have very strong commuter associations, including a women commuters association. And all of them constantly keep on complaining about the overall responsiveness of the railways to their issues. Toilets are there, then the entire information system which is present in coaches, sometimes being too loud or sometimes being all garbled. And I think all of these are actually issues that one talks about, which are governance issues. Besides these, there are sensitive design issues. And these design issues also, I think there are several ones. I think Nandita mentioned one earlier in terms of talking about the height at which the handrails are posted. Okay? And none of these, I think they are not designed keeping in mind the standard heights of Indian men and women, both. Okay? So it's difficult both in men's compartments, but even more difficult in women's compartments. The entire gap between the footboard and the platform, which makes it very difficult for women who often wear long clothes, or there are burqas or chunnis and the saris, to get into the train compartment. So there are a range of these kind of design issues as well. And I'll come to the second case, which I think is of a very different order of infrastructure. We talked about commuting infrastructure, which involves big money. This is actually infrastructure which has usually been neglected, given a lot of political rhetoric in the last few years through the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, but yet continues to be an extremely dismal scenario. I'm again talking of, and I'm going to talk of a particular ward in Mumbai called the M East ward. So M East is basically an administrative ward in the northeast periphery of Mumbai. But this is also a ward which has a concentration of polluting uses and unwanted people. Okay? Every city has their M wards. These are the Harlems of the world, which will concentrate all kinds of uses like dumping grounds and polluting industries. And these are typically the wards where you will also set up your resettlement colonies. So it's like all general dumping together, okay? Whether it is people, whether it is these kind of uses, and that's the way in which the state deploys these kind of spaces. And along with this, if you will see, this is also, contrarily, it becomes a more inclusive space because it has a high proportion of informal settlements. Okay? Now, when you have such concentrations of poor people, there should be a accompanying high level of public investment in this ward. Okay? What one is seeing is that this is not there. In fact, this ward is treated as a low investment ward. In fact, I remember one year in which all the councillors, municipal councillor in this ward, they sat on a fast saying that our ward is like the tribal area of Mumbai. Declare M East ward the most backward ward in the entire city of Mumbai. So it has low levels of transport within the ward itself. Even reaching the ward office becomes difficult for several settlements. Water levels, sanitation provision. There are so many parts which don't have sewer lines at all. Or in terms of the really social sectors of infrastructure like education and health provisions. As a result, clearly this ward is one of the, it's the lowest human development index in the city. So what is the state approach to this ward? First, if it is a slum, then you only provide public toilets. And the forms that these public toilets take are sometimes pay and use, sometimes free, sometimes they are managed by CBOs, or they are managed by slum adoption institutions. They are often constructed through MP or MLA development schemes. And individual toilets, even if they are demanded by women, they are denied them because there is a lack of sewer lines in the area, and there is an unwillingness to invest in completing the incomplete links of sewerage. So even when, I think Nandita talked about the gender sensitive plan in the city, right? Gender inclusive plan in the city. But even in that plan, you will see that plan mentions that of all the public conveniences in the city, only 20% of the public conveniences would be reserved for women. So if you look at the case of sanitation, this is the prevalent approach of the state. And so we come to, what does one mean by this situation? If you look at public toilets, then this is the ratio that you get, and which is one part of M East Ward, Mankhurd, within which I'm talking of only 5 to 6 settlements. The overall population of Mankhurd is roughly around 90,000 people. And within which these 6 settlements that we are talking about. Transit set Camp B has 85 people per toilet seats, if one is looking at public toilets, public provisioning. Jyotirling Nagar, 100 people per toilet seat. Maharashtra Nagar, 151 people per toilet seat. Transit Camp A, 170 people per toilet seat. Mandala, 191 people per toilet seat. And Transit Camp in Maharashtra Nagar has no toilets at all. Okay. Now, if you start looking at this status of public provisioning, and this is the status of toilets. Okay. So I'm not even getting into description of what is produced through this state given system. Now you will understand what is the state infrastructure. So what is incomplete infrastructure? So what do people do? What do women respond in? Through their own models, and which is, I feel, this is the completion of infrastructure. This is people at infrastructure, really. So there are several of these settlements, including the Transit Camp B, which I talked of Maharashtra Nagar, where there are informal community toilets for women, which are constructed by people. These are really ragamatag toilets, where there is just like 4 walls covered by plastic sheets. There are 2 bricks, so that in all the muck you can still stand, and you have a pit which has been dug. So this is the form of informal community toilets. Then there are at least 2 settlements that I know where people themselves have constructed again, these are built toilets, properly built with bricks and everything. I'm done. Yeah. Which are at the end of every chawl. So you entirely reverse the concept of public toilet and really make it into a community toilet, make it possible for a much restricted group. There are other forms like restricting the use of public toilets and essentially converting them to community toilets. There are many women who play a role in the cleanliness and maintenance of toilets, sometimes by employing someone and contributing to the payment to this person and buying cleaning materials. Or there are many places like Shivaji Nagar where you will see that individual toilets are actually being constructed by contractors in total defiance of state policy. To me, all of these are forms by which people are behaving as infrastructure. And mind you, in most of these cases, women play a driver's role. Okay? So if to conclude, I think it's easy to see in some ways that women are facing excessive burdens when they live in informal settlements or in peripheral areas. So how does one conceptualize absent infrastructure really? Okay? How does one think of options? How does one execute such projects? How does one maintain infrastructure? And in all of these, one sees as women as the invisible leaders behind all of these projects, which are infrastructure projects. State policy, I would say, invisibilizes women further. How does it invisibilize? First, by perceiving all infrastructure as gender neutral, whether it is commuting, whether it is sanitation, all of these. Second, by perpetuating the public and the private divisions. okay, and not caring for the private, especially in terms of the poor women. Okay, no individual toilets there, only public toilets kind of thing. And undermining the presence of women in public places. Why only 2.5 compartments for women? Why only 6 seats for women? Why railway compartments will run for women only in predictable hours, not end-to-end hours for all the time that railway routes and railway services work? I think these are questions which also need to be asked. Why only 20% toilets for women in public places? Okay. Then the dirigistic approaches to law and technology. Our sewer lines will run only in places which minimally have 6 meters distance between lanes. Okay? So these kind of approaches to technology, or railway systems minimally have to have so much of land. And okay, so what is really required there? And the same dirigistic approach one will also see in law many, many times. Perpetuating the formal and the informal divide, where you emphasize on the formal and completely neglect the informal. Neglecting design. So you look at infrastructure investment, the grand plan, but you don't fill in the design, the governance, and that's what one creates several schisms about. Thank you.
And of course, wearing a different hat, because it's not just as a gender advocate, but probably the hat which puts the kind of onus which the speaker just before me put on better connect between governance and planning. And I'm aware of the fact that representing a ULB, I'm actually required not only to perceive how sensitive it is to understand this connect, but also to take the whole cycle through to be able to implement it on ground. And what I'm just going to share with you, is in terms of the conventional understanding, what we have today. Some things in which I've seen, like the place that I come from today is the New Delhi Municipal Council. Well, it is, kind of a unique body in the country, right here in the middle of New Delhi. And it's comparable, so to say, to a world-class city. At least it always aspires for. So what we do over here is even more meaningful because it is considered to be like a trendsetter in many things for the rest of the municipal bodies, the ULB especially in the country. And what we conventionally understand by social infrastructure in terms of definition, and when I talk to my colleagues within, we do understand that we are talking about not just hardware. We do understand that today we are talking about the quality of life. Floating population, if you see, is very, very large, around 1.6 to 2 million per day within a small area. And the social infrastructure that we normally relate to is, as you see the list which, conventionally you would be looking at, with the inclusion of also parks and gardens, and public libraries, happiness areas, subways. So I'll be coming to these, because in terms of the social infrastructure, now we have built, these very nice working women hostel. So when I said that, like a trendsetter, so there are people who come to see that, okay, this is the kind of, design where we need to provide safe habitat for the working women. But again, it's too small a number. So what we are doing over here, maybe it still needs to multiply across, the NCR, and it needs to multiply definitely in other parts of the country too. Now, I've given this small design of something called a bike sharing system. This is because this is again something that we realize that in terms of, looking at building the day-to-day experiences of being a gender-friendly city, it is important not only to look at the public transport as a whole, in terms of providing metro or, good bus services, but looking at also the last mile connectivity. So this is something new that we are coming up with. The bikes, the bike talks, and particularly, keeping the girls, women in mind, who can, after alighting from the metro, they have this advantage of using a service which is economical and at the same time convenient and secure. Now, art in the subway. Now, these are again some of the happiness area. Now, some of the things which we never talked about in terms of our experiences of a municipal body earlier. But we do realize that in terms of social infrastructure, while it would be obligatory to do certain things, but at the same time, for any body like this, there are many discretionary functions. It may not be obligatory for us to work on, creating this experience of having happiness areas, but important that old places which were earlier in dump yard, which were earlier not lit up, today are found to be more secure, bright, pleasing for women, for girls as a whole, but also, in general for the habitat as a whole. I won't say confined to women alone, but in general also, if you're improving the habitat, I think it does help in terms of, bringing the feeling of security and sensitivity all around in the infrastructure. Well, now I'll be looking at Kalpana because this is what they gave to us. It's a safety audit report. And it told us that, where we rate is 3.5. Why so? Because your report points that lighting and walk path provided poor visibility, 20% locations, the boundary wall, it probably impeded the visibility part of it. And also it was very interesting to see that despite the fact that, I'm talking about all these like smart things in the city, you're saying that there's an overall low rating with the, on the feeling of safety. Few women are seen at night. So lesser the number of women seen at night, the lesser the perception of safety would be for people like you and me as a whole. But this was in 2016. So there were certain actions taken thereafter. Now, what these actions were in terms of like where the street lights were not working, fixing those, adding the street light, where there were none probably, or, locating further dark patches. So the report did help us in able to diagnose, how it really matters in terms of, lowering our safety scores. And earlier probably, it was more of an infrastructure issue, which was gender neutral. Based on assessment like these, evaluations and audit like these, we realize that it's no more just a, standard infrastructure issue. It has a lot to do with, the impact which it has on women's safety as a whole. Even a small thing like pruning of trees. There are, innumerable cases where it is pointed out that the lights, they are just not being able to penetrate down because there's been very, very, infrequent effort at pruning of the trees by the horticulture department, which obstructs the street lights. Now, based on these things, now some of the things that we are recently coming up with in terms of the smart technology, we keep hearing of the use of technology, the smart applications, even the safety pen in terms of the safety audit, which it conducted, that is also based on the use of a smart app. And of course, there's human intervention, but, aided, facilitated by the smart app and technology. So here, the polls, some of the things which I just wanted to draw your attention to, because I'm aware that you come from different states, and probably when we are looking at smart city concept, it is important to see that within that concept, the infrastructure that we are coming up with, the new technology that you are, using, say for light, now what it can do. Now this very simple thing of a smart pole, it brings Wi-Fi connectivity, it has CCTV in it, it has LED street light in it, and it has connectivity to a central control and command center. Similarly, for the number of LED screens and all which you'd see around Connaught Place now, it is supposed to provide information to the citizens, to the tourist, who would be absolutely kind of raw in terms of what they are entering in especially those coming from abroad. And Plus, it has small facilities like mobile charging point, free Wi-Fi. So we feel that all these things again, build towards creating that environment which is important, for any space to have that, kind of foundations on which it is important that, say the use of safety app. If you don't have a connect to a Wi-Fi, how are you expected to really be able to use the equipments which are there with you. So we are just trying to bring these connects, and I'll be happy to share with you that recently in one of our programs, when the Lieutenant Governor came for inaugurating something in CP. Now, his attention was drawn to the fact that, okay, there are these interactive panels. You have a mobile charging station, and he posed a question: is it possible that a woman is able to lodge a complaint like a FIR, which can be connected straight away to the police, instead of moving around in circles? So questions like those again pose the challenge upon us, to look at how best to now build upon the foundations which we already have created, the connectivity in terms of the control and command center with the police, with the apps which the smartphones are providing to the woman today. But at the same time, I'm also aware of the fact that everything may not be as smart. I'm just coming. In fact, I got delayed, because of election process going on for the town vendor committee, right here in the Sarojini Nagar school. So when I went there, now there was a demand by the women's groups who were standing, the voters, so to say. Now what the demand was that, there's no separate line for women and there's jostling for space. So there's no technology needed for it. Very simple, small solutions. So probably we need to bring about greater sensitization to those things which may not conventionally fit in the definition of smartness. Coming back to what is being done. Now these are some of the smart toilets, with 24/7 water, power, and also sanitary napkin vending machines. So we just launched some of these here in Delhi. And the control and command center, I particularly brought the photograph for you to see, because I think it has immense potential, provided we all engage with it as citizens to be able to pose that demand on this command and control center. For example, this would be connected to what's happening in a marketplace like underground Palika Bazaar at night or in the evening or during the day, or the subways and the tunnels. It would be connected to that. So we are looking for solutions. We're looking for solutions where things like these we are able to, because I'm aware of the fact that there's a huge risk. There's a huge risk, like investments like these, to procure, install machines and hardware, and even the software, unless and until we are able to really make that connect between what the citizens are wanting for it to respond to. Can it reduce the response time? Or the command and control center is again something, which would be a very static thing, which is able to just give us, some kind of MIS at the end of the month for us to say that, okay, we have that many number of smart poles, that many number of CCTVs. So what is important is that we are able to use these facilities in an utmost dynamic manner to have the kind of response which it is needed to fix the system, not only respond to a problem, not only respond to emergency or respond to crisis, but it is important that we fix the problem before a crisis happens. Small things which in a report like safety fin, when you bring out, like street lights, so we should not really wait for the audit to happen, but it should be telling us on a day-to-day basis what needs to be fixed and what needs to, who needs to be accountable for it. Because even that accountability matrix is important. Okay, just 2 minutes, yeah. So I'll, end with some of the other efforts which we feel that it is important for any ULBs to look at: regular safety audits, regular, working with a checklist, and now in the phase 2, some of the efforts which are being undertaken in collaboration with Safety Pin again are looking at markets, schools, tourist destinations, and the assessment which is being carried out on the 3 major criteria: lighting, walk path, and visibility. But I personally feel that it needs to go beyond these 3 criteria. You probably need to, and this discussion which you've been having since yesterday maybe will reveal, what are the further other criterias which we really need to look at when you apply any such audit tools. In our schools, we had a recent incident where we were shocked that right under our nose, a school which we thought was safe can be so unsafe. So are we able to train all our teachers and the non-teaching staff as well, to know, learn, and be accountable to the concept of a safe school? The use of sports for girls, improving connectivity as a whole, improving our public libraries. Now, all these things are meant to, again, build an environment which I think the municipal body should be using as a part of their obligatory as also discretionary functions. Art in subways, civic engagement. Now, some of the challenges which you're aware of is still the last mile connectivity, no matter how brilliant a transport system you plan. Ensuring safety in our schools, full safety of a child to be able to speak. The challenge of low social capital, full awareness of what we have in terms of tools and technology. Water management, I particularly said, because the other day I was talking to Akila ji that I went to one of the clusters over here where there are women thronging around the water tankers with loads of pipes inside, with utter unruliness, lots of water being wasted. So my question was that this itself is breeding a lot of, unsafe environment around. It was not just a question of water, what more can be done about it? So this is a, challenge for us. The regular, not only the availability, but also the regular maintenance of toilets and the regular operation and maintenance of all our facilities. That is a huge challenge. Keeping the societal connect, which we call the civic engagement, it is a huge challenge. To build that ownership, it is a huge challenge. And I look forward to solutions emerging from consultations like these so that, people like me working on this issue from within the system are able to respond to the challenges better and more effectively. Thank you.
I'm going to wear 2 hats. One, and share the work that I've done at ITDP, but some of the work that I've done previously as well. So what does a feminist urban future mean for me and for us is one that is a sustainable urban future, one that is rooted in environment sustainability, social equity, as well as economic growth, right? Now, so therefore, when we are talking about transport and when we are talking about cities, we are primarily talking about access, right? I'm going to focus here on more on the physical, I'm going to talk more about transport and spatial planning. I think we have spoken about other aspects elsewhere. So what are the 2 ways in which you can facilitate access? One is through transportation systems that take you, say, from a origin, from your home to a destination. And the other way is to get those destinations closer to you as well. And it is not only about getting them closer to you, but arranging them. I mean, it's not like a game, but their arrangement and design in a way that makes them accessible to us. And I just want to underscore over here is that when we are talking about access, we are talking about sustainable, when we come to mobility, what does sustainable mobility mean? So we have research globally that says women have inferior access to both private and public means of transport while assuming a higher share of their household's travel burden as well. We have both work and care responsibilities. And then therefore, what should the priority for transport be if we put gender at the center, right? So let's look at data. I think there is some research over here, and I will also respond to Amita's point. One, that because of women's role as caretakers, we don't take trips typically, say, from home to workplace, but we might also make other trips along the way. Second, we might have other trips that also matter as much as the work trip, right? So let's acknowledge that. More likelihood of being accompanied by a traveler, a dependent or otherwise, and that women's mobility may remain consistent in the peak and off-peak hours. It doesn't mean that more travel during the off-peak hours, but they may remain consistent, primarily one, because there might be other caretaking responsibilities as well. This also means that women may make more shorter trips but frequent trips. Talking in the case of Mumbai, one thing to mention is that in a city like Mumbai, close to 50% of the trips are actually on foot. So even when we are talking about suburban railway systems, we have to position this in a city that primarily moves on foot as well. So I think that was also the other piece that I want to make. So therefore, how does one think about this mobility of care, right? And when we look at conventional transport planning, we talk about different kinds of trips. But if we actually look at the mobility of care, you would be able to repurpose, right, some of these trips and actually talk about trips made for care work, which would bring importance to the trips, one, that are predominantly currently played by women. These may not in the future, and we may not want it as well, but it is something to account for. So let's talk data. We actually looked at the Census of India's data in 2011, which focused primarily on mode of travel to place of work. And therefore, we looked what were the trips that were made by men and women. When we are talking about sustainable modes of transport, we are talking about modes of transport that are equitable and environmentally sustainable. That is walking, the use of cycles, and the use of public transport. So when we look at an article that says that perhaps the government of Haryana has facilitated some kind of project that gives women mobility on motorized two-wheelers, this is something that we also need to question, because we have to also question the impact of our mobility on the environment as well. So let's look at this. When we looked at the travel to place of work, we found that 73% of all trips means a trip from home to work in this case, right? Or work to home. So that would be 2 trips. 73% of all trips were made by sustainable modes of transport. This is in urban areas, non-farm work in India. Women's trips were only 14%. Okay? This comes with a caveat, and that is one, of course, they must have simply asked, "Aap apne kaam pe kaise jate ho?" They might have perhaps gone to the market. Those trips might have been undercounted. We recognize this limitation, but let's still move on. But when we actually look at women themselves, we find that 84% of their trips were made by sustainable modes of transport, right? So they are either walking, very low use of cycles, they're using bus, they're using train, they're using water transport. You will also find other interesting data. We looked at roughly 5 big cities. We found that a higher percentage of women were working from place of residence, right? So they were not traveling for work, but they were working from place of residence. The data did show that women in general had the average distances traveled by them were lesser than the distances traveled by men. Some of the trip distances, if you see the greens, you see that you have what are the average travel distances in a city like Calcutta, 1 kilometer, Mumbai, 3 kilometers. And you actually wonder, is that, okay, if this is the distance, could that distance be also covered by a bicycle, for example, right? Sorry, I have graphs, but let's see how we can work with them. So when you actually compare, and these are different cities again, we see that at least 70% of women across some of our biggest cities in India are walking, cycling, or using public transport. And I think it is very, very important for us to remember that, compared to at least this is about 75%. With men, it becomes at least 60%. However, when you look at cycling trips, you realize that women's mode shares of cycles are much, much lower. And this has many, many reasons, one of which is a concern for safer cycling environments. And by this I mean road safety. It might also mean access to bicycles, not knowing how to cycle as well. And these also become critical elements, right? So when we actually also, we have, this is one. But when you look at the overall context, the context of urbanization as well as growing use of personal motor vehicles. So you see about 180 million vehicles that were registered in India about 2014. This is a little dated, of which 75% were two-wheelers. But if you see the government's priority, the state's priority at this point, it is to prioritize the movements of cars and motorized two-wheelers. And I think this is one, when we kind of zoom out, we need to actually first question this priority. Who are we giving access to? Second is when we actually even talk about efficiency, right? Let's take an efficiency argument as well. We find that if you had to accommodate the same number of people in cars versus a bus, right, you would need about 8 times more space. Right? And so then you also put a question of how you are also efficiently allocating road space. And today, I mean, we see it on our roads. You go outside. Today, the way our cities are seen to facilitate the movement of personal motor vehicles. And a city or a street, for a city for women is a city that that is planned for its people, right, and allows a balance at the top, followed by non-motorized vehicles, right? Cycles are only one form. We have cycle rickshaws. We have, people who deliver our gas cylinders as well, and so we have a variety of non-motorized vehicles, public transport with personal motor cars at the bottom. Now, so let's keep this framework in mind, but having said that, just because you promote sustainable transport doesn't mean that it will cater to its women. And I think we are seeing this because this is something we need to keep in mind. So the National Urban Transport Policy in 2006 said that we need to design our cities for people and not for cars. When the JNNURM reforms were evaluated, about 50% of the expenditure on transport actually went on roads, bridges, and flyovers, right? So that is one thing to put out. But what also happened is that the JNNURM at the time also, for the first time, made cities prepare comprehensive mobility plans, and also said that we will have indicators and service level benchmarks to evaluate the mobility plans. There are enough challenges in all of these. Right now I'm going to focus on what those indicators and the service level benchmarks were. One of the key pieces amongst many others was that we found that gender was not integrated explicitly and consistently. This is one example, there are others. How? One of the indicators was average waiting time, right? Now, when it said average waiting time, not disaggregated by gender and not disaggregated by peak or off-peak hours. So therefore, you don't know who is waiting more based on which time during your peak or your off-peak. Second, another gap, and I'm just very quick saying that percentage of the city which is covered with footpaths that are only 1.2 meters wide, have a tree in the middle and there's no space to walk. And then what is the response? Cut off the tree, right? So these kind of indicators don't help. And so therefore we actually looked at these indicators and began to create a set. ITDP, Safety Pin together created a policy brief on women and transport in Indian cities that wanted to create gender responsive indicators as well as benchmarks to evaluate mobility plans. Just want to put some other numbers out there. I know we talk about the Nirbhaya Fund, which is about 3,000 crores, right? Close to about $500 million. You have other investments in transport, right? The Green Urban Mobility Scheme was announced in 2017, about $11 billion. We are talking environment, but we are not talking gender. And I think that there is a need to also look at where urban transport investments are being made and how we are able to integrate gender in them. So we released the policy brief in July 2017, convened a consultation with about 30 women's group practitioners, academics, to get feedback on the policy brief and to actually recommend one gendered mobility plans. I don't have too much time to explain this process, but it's there in the policy brief. But I'm going to just give some indicators, right? One, we had to be specific. Right, and these actually just look at the outcomes. Percentage of women and girls living within 500 meters walking distance of public transport in the city and in the metropolitan region, because I think as a number of speakers before me have mentioned, the challenge of good, frequent, accessible transport is also in the peri-urban areas. And so we wanted to put that, and we also wanted to put frequency, because frequency of public transport makes a big difference to which mode they may take. We then spoke about mode shares disaggregated by gender, which mode was being used. Non-motorized trip time and non-motorized trip distances. This particularly relates to women's time poverty. Were women, for example, walking 3 kilometers or more when if a cycle or a safer cycling environment could be created, their trip time could also be reduced. And therefore, we also included this. Cost of transport per month, household cost of transport, state and city transport budget that specifically benefits women and girls, and improved air quality. How do we make the link between gender and air quality? And we said that reduction in air pollutants due to women and girls' use of sustainable transport. Because a lot of the money that is coming to improve air quality may not focus on gender. Right, and our reason for doing this was to make those explicit connections that if you have a safer public transport system, you will have more women use it, which directly has an impact on air pollution as well. And I think that our goal was to link these multiple points. We also had some other mode-specific indicators and benchmarks, which I will not talk about. We made some recommendations to governance as well. Quickly talking about gender, city planning and design. I'm going to run through these. We partnered with Safety Pin and Janki Devi Memorial College to actually conduct safety audits around bus terminals in Delhi. Why bus terminals? Over 52 lakh trips, which is twice the number of trips that are made on the metro, are made by bus. And we wanted to evaluate the quality of access to bus terminals. What we found was that on average, the 10-minute walking radius to a bus terminal was hostile, right? We have some data about 90% of the terminals had very poor walk paths around them. Only about 37% of terminals had any mixed use that would provide some form of informal surveillance. Only about 10% of the terminals, even in the day, had about less than 10 people on average in public spaces, right? And what we also did, however, is evaluated the terminals also from a road safety perspective. So in addition to conducting the safety audits, we looked at the quality of shade. We looked at the quality of crossing facilities and public toilets as well. And we found that only 3 terminals had toilets that were accessible by women. In other toilets, they were being used as storage, they were either locked up, and so on and so forth. So what did our recommendations include? Now, our recommendations came down to being very, very specific. Women are also pedestrians, right? And so we looked at road safety as well as other aspects that would relate to this feeling of personal security as well. Very simple design measures looking at creating safer pedestrian crossings. Concepts which may not seem right, which may not a level of service approach to the design of footpaths, which means that you look at your demand and you provide the width of your sidewalk based on that. This is already there in some of our guidelines, and we wanted to use those to make our recommendations. Yes, we did talk about street lights as well, but also spoke about other ways in which, for example, you could improve visual connectivity. Multiple ways, either through seating or through more visual connectivity. One sec. And how multiple elements come together, right? Where should, for example, your tree be placed on the footpath so that there is visibility? So if I'm standing, I can see the bus coming and I don't have a tree obstructing it. To making sure that we have transparent back panels, because we know that that is also a big issue as far as visibility is concerned. The last piece is on gender, on city planning. In 2014, we had an opportunity to contribute to the National Urban and Regional Development Plan and Plan Formulation and Implementation Guidelines, where we were able to put in some aspects related to how cities could be designed. I'm sharing this so that it's by no means perfect. I think it's a start, but I feel that it's a start that can be used to actually look at pushing other cities to adopt these guidelines, looking at more decentralized, polycentric cities, mixed land uses, street connectivity, recommending pedestrian and cycling infrastructure, talking about compound walls and how they affect perceptions of safety or security as well, talking about housing and focusing on upgradation versus relocation, location of amenities, and talking about public transport and street design. I think I'll just leave recommendations for now.
Time. अपने शहरों को अपना बनाएंगे, हमने तय कर लिया है. अपने शहरों को सेफ बनाएंगे, हमने तय कर लिया है. कैदी बन के ना अब जी पाएंगे.